If making friends feels like a performance instead of something natural, the problem isn't your personality, it's actually the way your mind processes connection. And the more you try to fix yourself to fit in, the more disconnected you actually feel. That's the part no one talks about. Most people assume that struggling socially means you're awkward, unlikable, or maybe just missing some basic social skill. But in reality, a lot of people who struggle to make friends are doing something very different psychologically. They're not failing at connection. They're filtering it more intensely than others. And that changes everything. Why does surface-level connection feel exhausting, not exciting? For many people, casual interaction is energizing. Small talk, group conversations, quick bonding moments, it all feels natural. But for someone who struggles to make friends, these same interactions often feel draining, forced, or just kind of empty. This usually comes down to depth perception in social behavior. Some people are wired to look for meaning first, not familiarity. So when conversations stay on the surface, weekend plans, gossip, repetitive jokes, it doesn't really register as connection. It just feels like noise. Over time, this creates a pattern. You show up, you engage just enough to be polite, but internally, you're disconnected. And because you're not fully present, others feel that distance too. Not in a dramatic way, just enough that the interaction never deepens. It's not rejection, it's misalignment. Why overthinking quietly sabotages connection? One of the most common traits in people who struggle socially is not a lack of awareness, but honestly, too much of it. You replay conversations after they happen. You analyze tone, timing, word choice. You notice subtle shifts in people's reactions. And instead of letting interactions flow, your mind is constantly evaluating them. In psychology, this is often tied to heightened self-monitoring. You're not just in the conversation, you're, observing yourself having the conversation. And that creates friction, because real connection relies on a certain level of spontaneity. When every response is filtered through, is this the right thing to say? Or, how are they perceiving me right now? Your natural rhythm disappears. People don't consciously think, this person is overthinking. They just feel that something is slightly off. The interaction lacks ease, and ironically, the more you care about connecting, the harder it becomes to actually connect. Why past experiences make you more cautious than others? Another layer most people overlook is how memory shapes social behavior. If you've experienced rejection, exclusion, or subtle social failures, especially earlier in life, your brain doesn't just forget that, it adapts. You become more observant, more careful, less willing to take emotional risks without certainty. From a psychological standpoint, this is protective. Your brain is trying to prevent future discomfort. But in social situations, it can come across as distance, hesitation, or even disinterest. For example, instead of initiating a conversation, you wait for clear signs that you're welcome. Instead of expressing your real thoughts, you test the waters first. Instead of assuming acceptance, you assume neutrality at best. And that delay in openness often prevents the connection from forming at all. It's not fear in an obvious sense, it's caution disguised as composure. Why independence can quietly isolate you. Here's something that sounds like a strength, but often becomes a barrier. Many people who struggle to make friends are highly self-sufficient. They don't rely heavily on others for emotional regulation, entertainment, or validation. On the surface, this looks like confidence, and in many ways it is. But friendships are built on interdependence, not independence. If you rarely need anything from others, advice, support, shared experiences, you naturally create fewer opportunities for connection. Not because you're avoiding people, but because your life functions well without constant social input. The problem is, closeness often develops through small dependencies. Asking for help, sharing uncertainty, letting someone see you in an unfinished state. If you skip those moments, people may respect you, but they don't feel needed by you. And without that emotional exchange, friendships struggle to take root. Why does being different create this sort of invisible distance? Well, a lot of people who struggle socially carry this quiet but persistent feeling that, I don't fully fit in. Not in a dramatic or isolating way, but more in these subtle, hard-to-explain ways. Maybe your humor doesn't always land, or your interests just don't align with the group, or your perspective feels, slightly out of sync with everyone else. Psychologically, this creates what's called perceived social difference. And even when it's not objectively true, just the perception alone can change the way you behave. You start to hold back more. You reveal less. You find yourself editing your thoughts before you speak. And over time, that self-editing just becomes your default mode. The result isn't outright rejection. It's something I'd call partial visibility. People only see a filtered version of who you are. And honestly, it's really hard to form a real connection when you're only partially seen. So, why does emotional depth make connection rarer, but so much stronger? Here's the part that often gets misunderstood. Struggling to make friends doesn't mean you're incapable of connection. It usually means your threshold for meaningful connection is just higher than average. You're not looking for constant interaction. You're looking for resonance, conversations that actually go somewhere, people who are self-aware, relationships that feel mentally and emotionally engaging, and those are statistically a lot rarer. So instead of having many casual friendships, you tend to have fewer but deeper connections. Or sometimes none for a period of time, which can feel confusing, because you know you're capable of connecting when the right person comes along. This isn't a flaw. But it does require patience and, more importantly, understanding. Because if you misinterpret this as a personal failure, you'll try to force connections that were never meant to work in the first place. What actually helps, without forcing yourself to become someone else, is pretty simple. The goal isn't to turn yourself into a highly social person if that's not who you are. It's really about removing the friction that's blocking natural connection. And that starts with reducing self-monitoring in conversations. Not by ignoring social awareness, but by shifting your focus outward. Instead of evaluating how you're being perceived, try paying attention to what's actually being said. Let your responses be just a little less perfect and a bit more real. It also means tolerating small amounts of social risk, like saying something before you're completely sure it will land, or sharing a thought without fully filtering it. These micro-risks are what create openings for connection. And, importantly, it requires recognizing that depth doesn't happen instantly. Even meaningful relationships often start with a phase that feels a bit surface level. That's not because the connection lacks potential, but because trust hasn't formed yet. If you exit too early, you never reach the depth you're actually looking for. Here's a more accurate way to understand yourself. Struggling to make friends is often misdiagnosed as a social weakness, but in many cases it's actually a combination of high self-awareness, emotional depth, past learning, and selective connection. In other words, your mind isn't working against you, it's just calibrated differently. The problem is when you judge that difference instead of understanding it. Because once you understand the pattern, you stop forcing yourself into environments and dynamics that don't fit. You become more intentional about where you invest your social energy and more patient with how connection actually develops. And that's really when things start to shift. Not because you became more likable, but because you became more aligned. If you want more insights like this, grounded, honest, and rooted in real psychological patterns, subscribe to It's All Psychological. And if this made you see your own behavior differently, share it with someone who's been quietly struggling with the same thing.